Okay. Enough of the fun and games. Let's get away from the coffee and come find your seat. And while you're finding your seat, I thought I'd make a couple of quick announcements. Number one, when it comes to Peach Days, often we have a lot of anxiety about talking to strangers, especially talking to strangers about Jesus. Well, have I got a deal for you. It turns out that in 9 days from today, on August 29th, we're going to have a friend of mine who used to work for Jews for Jesus and who has a passion for talking to strangers about Jesus. And she's going to come spend the evening with us Tuesday evening on the 29th. And she's going to give us some tips about how to do that, as well as not just on Peach Days, but actually as a lifestyle. She's really passionate, very fun, very energetic. And I think she'll give you some great tips about what to do when you think about talking to strangers about Jesus. I know, always very awkward. But those opportunities come up during Peach Days, so we want to make sure you're equipped. So come for that Tuesday, August 29th. Now, where we left Mark last time we were there, I'm assuming everyone's in their seats, yes? Okay. Where we left Mark last time, Jesus had been over in Decapolis. And over in Decapolis, he was actually finishing, in a way, the Gentile ministry that he did. Before that, he did a gigantic and very productive ministry to the Jews in northern Galilee, not in the south where Jerusalem is, but in the north. And then he followed that up with a pretty large mileage ministry to the Gentiles. Now he's gotten in a boat, crossed over the Sea of Galilee, come back again to the western side of the Sea of Galilee. And on the western side is where the Jews are. And of course, when he left that western side of the Sea of Galilee, before he went up to Tyre and Sidon, he was in a fracas with the Pharisees. And sure enough, he comes back, lands in Magdala, which is just south of where he had left from. And there we start again with Pharisees. And so that's where we find ourselves today. He'll be engaged with the Pharisees from now until the crucifixion. Because from this point in the north in Galilee, he's going to start setting his sights toward going south to Jerusalem, where he knows the hot water is for him. So that's where he's going to go. But today, the first encounter after coming back from the Gentile tour, from Decapolis and the current day in Lebanon and places far beyond, today he comes back to that same discussion with the Pharisees that really aims at who his identity is. So, are we ready to jump into that? We're going to do it today in a couple of 4 scenes. And every scene will take me getting up and moving around and going to a new scene. So as we get seated and get ready to take a look at this section of Mark today, we're going to sit down and we're going to take a look at what Jesus has in store for the Pharisees once again. So hold on to your seats. Okay, here we are, scene one. And if you're following me this, we're in Mark 8. I'm going to look down here to read my Bible, but we're in Mark 8, and we're starting at verse 11. So we are back on the western side of the Sea of Galilee with the Jews, and unfortunately with some very suspicious, that's the word, suspicious Pharisees who want to know who this guy is and what he's doing. So Mark 8, verse 11, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. So you see what the gambit is right here. If indeed the news about Jesus is that he's claiming to be the Son of God, claiming to be the Messiah, well then do something Messiah-like. And since they are convinced that Jesus himself was a fraud, he can't do it, so this will embarrass him and it'll take him off the circuit. So in front of all these people, they demand that he do a sign. And that's put before him. Then after he deeply sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Again, this is sort of like what we had before where Jesus lifts his hand to heaven and groans. This is a deep sigh again. Deep sigh in his spirit. He's not irritated or frustrated. I think in a real sense, he's grieving over the lack of belief. He sighs deeply in his spirit. Why does this generation seek a sign? And then he says, truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. It's interesting because when you compare Matthew's gospel, Matthew fills out the narrative a little bit more because we know that Mark always does kind of minimize things. He's kind of the abridged version of these gospel encounters. So he gives us a little more detail. It's neither right nor wrong. It's just more complete. So when we take a look at Matthew's more complete dialogue, this is what we see in Matthew. In Matthew 16, verse 2, he says to them, when it's evening, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. Yeah, you can tell the weather. And then likewise, verse 3, in the morning, it'll be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times? Pretty damning comment to him, because he's right. They can predict the future of the weather, but they refuse to predict the coming of the Messiah. There was enough evidence, he's saying, like reading the clouds in the sky, there's enough evidence in the Old Testament that you should have gotten who I am, rather than placing down these silly requests for more miracles, which he's done plenty of, demanding in public that he demonstrate himself. No, you just don't want to believe. If you can read the clouds, you've read the Old Testament, the Tanakh, well enough to know that I'm that guy. Matthew 16:4, he caps up his comments to them. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. Now that's interesting. I mean, he says right now in both accounts, I'm not going to give you a sign right now, but it does go on in Matthew to say, but a day is coming when you will see a sign, and the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah, which of course is a very clear parallel. Jesus himself teases that out for us, where basically you've got someone who's representing God, Jonah, to a sinful generation, the Assyrians. He runs away, but then he's kind of dead and buried in a large fish for 3 days. And after those 3 days, he comes back and brings the news of repentance and salvation from God to the Assyrians, and they repent. I mean, they come right around. So what he's saying is that in the same way that it looked as though Jonah himself was dead and buried and gone, the Son of Man, Jesus himself, will be dead and buried, but not gone. And that will be the sign to you, the sign of Jonah, someone coming back literally from the dead after 3 days. That's the only sign you're going to get. And that should be sufficient. However, at one point, Jesus also says in this sequence of heaven and hell with Lazarus and the poor man, it turns out that the rich man who asked God himself to send back someone from the dead, then they'll believe what's going on. And Jesus says here and on another occasion that, even if someone comes back from the dead, it won't be persuasive to those who do not want to believe. So that's the point right here as well. Well, then at the end, verse 13 of Mark 8, he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. To get away from the Pharisees, maybe for a brief vacation. We don't know, but this is often the case, and we'll see this a couple times this morning, that he moves in order to decouple from the conversations that are coming down. So, end of scene 1, and we get up and we go to scene 2. Come right back. Okay, we're back. We're in scene 2. Mark 8, verse 14. So they get in a boat to go somewhere. He doesn't tell us where, but they go to another place. And then a shocking realization is made on the part of the apostles. Verse 14. Now they had forgotten to bring bread. They all got in the boat in such a hustle that they forgot to bring any food. They forgot to bring any bread. And they had only one loaf with them in the boat. Not enough for all the apostles and Jesus and whoever else might have been with them. So we have a problem. We're going to a desolate area. We got no food. But this sort of rings a bell, right? At this point, both of the Gospels that show this event don't say that they actually said anything at this point. This first sentence is more of a realization of the fact that, whoops, we have a problem here. But in the midst of that realization, presumably unvoiced, then he cautions them. Verse 15, Jesus cautions them saying, watch out! Watch out! About what? Well, watch out. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. So Jesus sticks in this bread-related comment, but this bread-related comment is about the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Now, what does that mean? Well, leaven, it's yeast. You put yeast in flour with some sugar and some water and stuff, and blah, 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 it bubbles and grows, and it makes the bread all fluffy, right? We know that it only takes a little pinch of yeast in that kind of a mixture, that once it's spread out by hand through the entire mixture, it spreads and grows invisibly and basically, in a good way, infects the entire recipe. During their time, they didn't have isolated yeast like we do right now. What they would do is more like sourdough starter. If you do sourdough starter, you usually take a pinch off of the old bread that you made, the old bread dough you made. You preserve it so that you can take that and infect the next loaf of bread with it. And then that grows, and you pinch some of that off and preserve it, and then infect the next one. You keep carrying it forward. That's more like what they're talking about. But when we talk about leaven, when we talk about yeast, the imagery is very powerful here. The imagery is the fact of something that's small, when left alone, can work and invade the entire mass of a thing and influence the entire thing. All unseen, all invisible, all without notice because it's so slow. And it's a great metaphor to use for many things. And in many cases, sin itself. Because sin, when it comes into a community, when someone says it's okay to do such and such a thing, it's okay to steal from people if they've got too much money, for instance, which is wrong. But when this sin comes into the community and the community accepts it, it sort of spreads like yeast amongst the people and grows and reproduces until it infects the entire thing. Sin does that, especially the enticement of sin. So Jesus wants to bring this up right now. He's basically saying, using that metaphor, don't let the influence of the Pharisees and the influence of Herod, especially when it comes to lies about who Jesus is and sinfulness altogether, don't let that infect you and spread through you. It's all about a matter of not becoming infected. Even when it looks small and insignificant, you need to put up a resistance against it. Well, he brings this up and doesn't explain it much, and the apostles go back to worrying about the bread. Verse 16, they're discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. They clearly missed what Jesus was trying to teach them. A great teaching moment wasted, it seems like. And then we go into verse 17. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread?" I'm talking about something else here. And you're obsessing about the lack of bread. Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? And do you not remember? See, that's what we're saying as we're reading this. Hey guys, feeding the 5,000, feeding the 4,000. You've seen it. What? Don't you remember? And so Jesus schools them on what they should be remembering. Verse 19. Look, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, and this is where intonation means everything. It'd be nice to have a literal recording of how they responded. How many pieces did you take up? And they said, 12. Or 12, like in a clueless way. Or, amazed, 12. I prefer the first reading of that. How many pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And then he goes on. And the 7 for the 4,000. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? Anyone? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, verse 21, do you not yet understand? Do you not yet understand? And at this point, what he does is he doesn't dwell on the matter at all. He just sort of reminds them and says, turn on the understanding. Turn on your ears and listen. Turn on your eyes and see. And I think at this point it was an effective rebuke. However, being the kind of guy that I am when it comes to Bible narratives, I'd sure like to know what happened next. Did Jesus actually make a lot of food for them miraculously? Did they eat? Did Jesus force them not to eat for a day or two? Just kind of say, yeah, there you go. Quit whining about it. And because you're whining about it, we're not going to have food. We don't know anything that happened after this. Did they eat or didn't they eat? Did Jesus do a miracle and bring food or not? I don't know. But that's really not the point of the entire encounter. The encounter is they need to have their hearing and listening and thinking turned on. Not only when it comes to the need for food, and we always have needs. Food, air, water. We are created to be needy for things outside of us. We are not self-sustaining by God's creative design. We need something outside of us. A gigantic clue that we need God himself in our created beings. regardless, that's the number one. That's the first level of thinking they should know. But second level thinking, Jesus is saying about the leaven. Don't forget about that. There is an influence that comes from Herod, the king in the area, and there's an influence that comes from the Pharisees. And when we're talking about bread, beware of the seductive infection of the ideas of these people. Don't let it change your thinking about the truth. So that's what he's talking about. Okay, we move on to the next scene, and we come to scene 3. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, and we're at scene 3. Scene 3. Mark 8, verse 22. Here we go. They cross again, and they come up to Bethsaida. Come to Bethsaida. And here's a picture of the Sea of Galilee. One more time before we forget this, because pretty soon we're going to leave northern Israel in Galilee, and we're going to forget this geography. So you remember I always talk about the Sea of Galilee and the villages that are around it that are mentioned in the narratives. And then I always think of it as a clock face. So here's the clock face that goes around. And if you start at about 8 o'clock on the clock face on the Sea of Galilee, is Tiberias. Even to this day, it's the largest city on the Sea of Galilee. It's quite a developed city there, right there, and you can see it in this picture from Google Earth. So at 8 o'clock is Tiberias. 9 o'clock is M for Magdala. And if you're thinking that sounds like Mary Magdalene, oh, that's what it means. She came from Magdala right here. She came from 9 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. 10 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee is Gennesaret, which is where we left from to go across country and go up the Lebanese coast to see the Syrophoenician woman, Gennesaret. Also, the sea goes by the name many times of the Sea of Gennesaret, named after that city. Then when you get to, 9, 10, 11 o'clock, when you get to 11 o'clock, that's Capernaum, his home base when he was doing his Galilean ministry, Capernaum. A lot of action happened there at the beginning of his ministry and for quite some time. And then when you get to 12 o'clock at the time, you get to Bethsaida, Beit House of Seda, fish, the house of fish. And it's roughly where the Jordan River comes in at the north end of the Sea of Galilee. Actually, we need to move Bethsaida a little bit to the right, like right to here. The reason is because Bethsaida is actually just off this the Jordan River to the right of it. So Bethsaida is more like 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock, somewhere in that range right there. So anyway, they came to Bethsaida. So I don't know where they'd come from, but they went up to the top again to Bethsaida, to the fishing village of Bethsaida. And some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. 23, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. So presumably, if you haven't read this before, presumably Jesus is going to heal this guy. Or he's going to refuse him and he doesn't want to embarrass him in front of the village. No, that's not going to happen. He will heal him, but he's going to take him out of the village to do it. A lot of speculation about why he did that, but he needs to get away from the people and to do this in a private context. This is not the only time that he will do this. So he takes him out of the village, and then we move on the narrative. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "Well, I see people, but they look like trees walking." Famous Johnny Cash song, "I see men like trees walking." So this is the only recording of a miracle that went in 2 steps. The first step was he got there kind of, sort of, but not completely there. I see people, but they look like trees walking. You can't make out facial features. They just like vertical things that are moving around in the ground. And then Jesus goes on in 25. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Yay! And he sent him to his home, saying, "Don't even enter the village." Again, we don't know exactly why the thing about isolating this act from the village is there. There's several reasons we could speculate about, but we'll just leave it at that for now. But it's interesting that this is a 2-step healing. We don't see any 2-step healings anywhere else. This is the only one of this case. Like, did Jesus not do it enough the first time? And some commentators, I think it was Adam Clark, I can't remember who it was, I read about this some time ago, but said that, well, the first, he says, think of it this way, and this is speculation as well. I mean, we're not really sure, but think of it this way. The first step in the healing was actually a complete healing. it was a complete healing. Well, but it doesn't sound complete because men look like trees walking around. It doesn't sound like his eyesight is really fully restored. However, what Clark brings up is the fact that many times if you see people who have been blind for a long time, maybe for life, their eyelids many times are kind of glued shut. And so it could very well be that Jesus fixed the problem of his eyeball so he could see again, but the problem of his eyelids being glued shut is still the problem. So he lays his hands on his eyes again, and maybe at that point what he does is he opens the eyelids, kind of gets past that thing. A very natural cure, which is, we need to get those lids open so you can see fully rather than through the crustiness that's been building under your eyelid for so long. And that could very well be what he did. The first one was the complete healing. The second one was just a very natural, here, let me help you out. That's a great speculation. We don't know. But it turns out that healing the blind is something that is characteristically reserved in Jewish thinking for only God himself. It's so impossible. Only God himself can do that. And in fact, when you read another healing of a blind man in John 9, it causes quite a stir because it's right in the hub of the religious leaders in Jerusalem. It causes quite a stir. This man is healed of blindness, equally as tough to do, and yet Jesus wants him to kind of keep it down below the radar. Could very well be it would have caused too much of a commotion if he had gone past that point. Healing of the blind man. And so we come to scene 4. I'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and we're in another place again. We're in scene 4, and we start scene 4 in verse 27. It says, Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. Now, I want to show you where this is. Here's Sea of Galilee again, and then the white, that's the path he took up to where the woman, the Syrophoenician Canaanite woman was. And that yellow line that goes up from Bethsaida at the top of the Sea of Galilee goes all the way up to that pinpoint, that yellow pinpoint in the picture on the map. It is literally as far north as you can go in Israel and still be in Israel. Almost to this day, that's very much true. There's a narrow piece of Israel that goes straight up from the Sea of Galilee that's considered Israel. However, if you go to the left, westward, toward the sea, you're in present-day Lebanon. During that time, present-day ethnic Phoenician and Syrian. If you go to the right of this yellow line, even to this day, you're in Syria. In fact, before the Six-Day War in 1967, the Israelis had a small armored contingent right up in this spot at the end of this yellow line, protecting that area because it was kind of bounded by two enemies. They had armor up there and some artillery. And the Syrians were on the right, and they were very close to that area and on a high hill, because everything to the right of that line actually goes up a very high hill. And the Syrians would put their artillery on top of that, and because of the height, could just rain down more shells all over that area. And it was really humiliating for the Israeli army. This is in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And because of that humiliation, the military armored generals said, we've got to get better at this, because when they would shoot back, it was impossible to figure out how to launch the shells up to get on the top of the hill where their artillery was. They worked on that for 4 to 5 years. They became experts at it. So that just before the Six-Day War, around 1965 and 1966, the Israeli armored troops that were here in this area where we call today Caesarea Philippi, it's called Banyas by them, they could actually way down in that valley where that yellow line is, aim their guns up and lob them on top of where the Syrian artillery positions were way up high and could destroy them. And they did that. And the Syrians had to pull back. Because of that intimidation from the Syrians, and because it caused the Israeli army to become experts on the use of artillery in uneven battlegrounds, that when the Six-Day War came about in 1967, they were clearly the armored experts, clearly the artillery experts on the battlefield, because they'd just been hounded for so many years by Syria. Okay, that's a little background about this area, but this is as far north as you can go and still be in Israel. One other little tidbit about this area, the tribe of Dan, when Joshua brought the tribes in the Promised Land, Dan actually relocated here after first trying to locate down by the Mediterranean near the Gaza Strip. It turns out that down there was a section of Canaanites that Joshua was unable to destroy and push out of the area. And so for a long time, Dan had just tremendous, irritating problems with these Canaanites who would not leave the area. So in their frustration, eventually, and in their defeats, just kind of dealing with them in the area, in their defeats, after all the other tribes have settled in the Promised Land, Dan, down there by Gaza, said, we give up down here. We don't like this place. We're going to find another place. Where can we go? They traversed up the entire length of the country, all the way north, up to the Sea of Galilee, past the Sea of Galilee, up into the Hula Valley above that, up that yellow line, until they came to the very spot where we call Caesarea Philippi today. And today, if you go to Israel and go to Caesarea Philippi, again called Banyas, right next to there is some archaeological digs about the tribe of Dan. And it was colloquially said in the Old Testament, when you want to talk about the entire breadth of Israel, from the north to the south of Israel, if you want to say something happened to the entirety of Israel from north to south, you would say that it happened in Israel from Dan to Beersheba, which is very far in the south in the Negev desert. So Dan was always considered to be the most northward place. So here we are, Caesarea Philippi, way, way far from home again, but still in Jewish territory. Jesus went to Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, since it's a long walk, it's a hefty one-day walk or a day and a half walk. On the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? Who do people say that I am? Which, by the way, kind of reminds us of what we've been looking for all the way through Mark. Because remember, in the three questions, the first question has to do about identity. Who do people say him? Who is Jesus? That's what we're trying to find out. Based on all the history and the narrative we've seen so far, who is Jesus? Now he's going to ask them, who do the people say that I am? And then, boy, this might be answering a lot of questions. Let me look at the passage a little further. Okay, who do people say that I am? Oh my gosh. A few verses later, he directly addresses his mission. Why did he come? What's he doing here? What's he got to accomplish? Whoa, we've hit pay dirt on answering our questions. I wonder if I go further. Oh, super pay dirt. We actually see in the couple verses after that, we see what it is that he asks of those who want to follow him. Whoa, this is pay dirt. We've gotten it. We've got our three questions answered in rapid succession right here in Mark 8. And you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop here today. I'm going to stop right here. Oh, don't do that to us. Oh, no, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop here. And what I want us to do is go back and relook at those three questions again. And here they are, superimposed on the Sea of Galilee. Who is Jesus? That's the identity question. Why did he come? That's his mission statement. What did he do to accomplish before he leaves? And thirdly, what does Jesus demand of those who want to follow him? That's the call. What's the call to us who want to follow him? What does he demand of us? And what I want you to do is, before we come back together next week in the park, reminder, come in the park next week, I want you to read these few verses. And here's how they're connected. Mark 8 is where we're at. You can answer the first question in verses 27 through 30. In those four verses, who is Jesus? Because remember, he asked them, we just barely touched our toes into it. He asked them, who do people say that I am? The issue of his identity is going to be what he's going to talk about with him. And then the next couple verses from 31 to 33, those three verses tell us exactly what his mission is. What he came to accomplish is in the next three verses. Whoa! And then best yet, because we've had very little information on this last question, what does Jesus demand from those who want to follow him? He covers it in great detail. Verses 34 to 38, in those five verses, he'll tell us exactly what he demands of those who want to follow him. And it will indeed be a way to distinguish his followers from his non-followers. So that's your homework for next week. Next week, come back, look at those verses, see if you agree with me that in from 27 to 38, from 27 to 38, in those handful of verses, he answers, who is he? Why did he come? What does he need to accomplish? And what does he demand of those of us who want to follow him? There it is. We finally found it. It's the lodestone. This is what we've been waiting for. You take a look at it, and then next week when we're in the park, we will ask those same three questions and see what you came up with as you read these passages and see exactly what they mean. Because just to prep you a little bit, the third question and the answer to the third question is sort of a tough one to sort out. And it's not tough because it's not easy to understand. It's tough because it demands a lot more than many people think it would. But there it is. So next time we'll come back and we'll take a look at those 3 questions, and we'll do that in the park and just discuss those. So take a look at that. Mark 8:27-38. Who is Jesus? Why did he come? What does Jesus demand of those who want to follow him? And we'll look at that next week. So I'm glad you're with us this morning, and we should be back by next week. And we'll look forward in the park next week, in the park, to discussing what we have finally found to answer our 3 questions together. So read it, digest it, pray over it, and we'll see exactly where God's leading us next week. So thanks for being with us this morning. Let's sing a song.